It's spoiler time once again. We're heading back to Ravnica, and this time, there's gonna be a murder. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Etrata, and it's time for our first daily dose of Murders of Karlov Manor spoilers. And Murders is the next premiere set of Magic, releasing officially the beginning of February. Today was the official start of spoiler season, and my goodness, do we have a ton to talk about. There's like a million new mythics, a bunch of rares, a new land cycle, a ton of new mechanics, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Murders at Karlov Manor cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout spoiler season, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Murders at Karlov Manor. So first up today, we got about a million new mythics, and we kick things off with the return of Etrata is Etrata Deadly Fugitive. So a Dimir 3-mana 1/4 legendary vampire with Death Touch. It says face down creatures you control have pay 4 mana, including some Dimir mana, turn this creature face up. If you can't, exile it, and you may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost. And then whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, cloak the top card of that player's library. Quick shout out to the dossier card style, so good, one of my favorite they've done in a while. But back to Etrata. Probably a little confused by this card. Why are we talking about face down creatures? What is cloaking? Well, the answer is Morph is back. Actually, not Morph, not even Mega Morph, but like Mega Morph. So Wizards is bringing back Morph. If you don't remember Morph, that's the mechanic where you can play things face down as 2/2 creatures and then flip them up. It's coming back as this combination of cloak and also disguise. So look at Aurelia's Vindicator, for example, a 4-mana 4/2 angel with flying lifelink and Ward 2. It has disguise of X3 and a white. And the disguise means that you can play this creature face down as a 2/2 creature, just like Morph, but the upgrade is it gets Ward. So it's essentially Morph with Ward of 2. So an upgraded version of Morph, and then you can pay the disguise cost to flip it up and get its ability that we'll talk more about later. Cloaking, on the other hand, refers to putting a card onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature with Ward 2, and then if it's a creature, you can pay its mana cost to flip it up, etc, etc, etc. So essentially Manifest, which is another twist on Morph, with the upgrade, of course, of having Ward 2. So in the context of a new Mega Morph returning to standard, Etrata makes actually a lot more sense. So if you hit your opponent with Etrata or another assassin, which probably isn't going to happen much in standard because we don't have many assassins, but if you hit your opponent with an assassin, you're going to steal the top card of their library as a 2/2 Ward 2 creature on the battlefield face down, and then if you want to, you can pay 4, and if it's a creature, you can flip it face up. So if you stole your opponent's, I don't know, some massive bomb cityscape leveler, let's say, you flip it face up, you got this bomby creature. If you happen to cloak a instant or a sorcery or a planeswalker, an artifact or an enchantment, you can't just flip it face up, because morphing or disguising or cloaking now only works with creatures, but you can still use Etrata's ability to play that card. You pay 4, you can't actually legally flip it face up because you can only flip face up creatures, and then you just get to cast that card for free. So I actually think Etrata is probably a very powerful card. I do think this will be a really popular build around in Commander. Like, it's kind of cool, it does unique stuff, it plays with the unknown with these mysterious face down cards, it generates card advantage, so I think it'll be popular in Commander, but I actually think this can be a standard card. It reminds me a bit of Preacher of the Schism, a card that was pretty underrated when Lost Caverns of Ixalan released, but then players realized that 4 toughness and Death Touch on a 3-drop is actually really annoying to attack into. Like, Etrata's the same, right? 2 a power, 1 power, doesn't really matter on a Death Toucher. So Etrata just like gums up the board really, really well on defense, and then you can attack with it. Your opponent's probably not going to want to block, and then rather than maybe drawing a card or making a token like Preacher of Schism, when you hit your opponent with Etrata, you're going to steal their top card as a face down 2/2 that maybe you can flip up later for even more value. So I think this definitely has a chance to show up in Standard. The other thing I love about this card is it interacts in a really interesting way, most likely in Commander, with some old mechanics like mana manifest. We were talking about Etrata's ability to let you cast face down cards that aren't creatures, which is relatively unique. We got like the manifest mechanic, which just puts random things into play as face down 2/2 creatures, like Cloud Form or Primordial Mist. The problem is, if you hit a creature, it's great, because then you can flip it up and it's awesome. But a lot of times you're going to hit a random instant or sorcery or planeswalker or something. Etrata gives you a way that you can actually make use of those, rather than just leaving them as relatively useless face down 2/2 creatures. The other place that I think this will shine in Commander is in Assassins, either leading an Assassin deck where you play this and you just overload on Dark Imposters, Cruel Sadist, every single assassin you can fit in, and then you play Etrata and swing at your opponents. And remember, it says whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent. So that means if you hit your opponent with 5 assassins, you're gonna get to cloak 5 cards from the top of their library, which is kind of ridiculous. That's a lot of Ward 2 2/2s on the battlefield that you can flip up later. So you just play all the assassins and turn this into like a weird Toski almost. It's just generating a ton of card advantage. The other place it'll be great is in other assassin decks, like OG Etrata, Ramsey's Assassin Lord, perfect fit there as well. So if you like assassins, Etrata's a really good option there. But don't think of this as just a commander card. I really think this has a chance to show up in standard, just like Preacher's Schism. Speaking of Aurelia's Vindicator, we talked about this one earlier. This was our example of the disguise mechanic. So disguise is literally morph, except when you're face down, you have Ward 2. So you can play Aurelia's Vindicator either as a 4 mana 4/2 flying lifelink Ward 2, or you can pay it face down for 3 mana of any combination of colors as a 2/2 Ward 2, and then you can use Disguise for 3 white and X to flip it face up, and that's really what you're going to want to do with this card. This card, not disguised, is pretty mediocre. A 4 mana 4/2 flying lifelink Ward 2, not the most exciting card. 2 toughness, kind of a problem, but if you disguise it, it's actually got a kind of powerful ability. When it's turned face up, you get to exile X other target creatures from the battlefield and or creature cards from the graveyard, and then when it leaves the battlefield, you return all the exiled cards to their owner's hand. So this is a way you can wrath your opponent's board temporarily. You can Eternal Witness a bunch of creatures back from your graveyard. My question for this card is it actually competitive enough? It is still just a 4/2. Its stats aren't great. I think it's actively bad if you're not disguising it, so you got to be willing to spend 3 to pay it face down, and then spend at least 5, and probably more than that, to flip it face up. You're still just getting a 4/2 with Flying and Lifelink and Ward 2, but it's still just a 4/2, but you are going to get its ability to get rid of some creatures, maybe generate some card advantage. It kind of reminds me of this weird Morphy Angel of Serenity. A decade ago, when we returned to Ravnica, Angel of Serenity was actually a legit card. When it ETBs, you kind of get the disguise ability on Aurelia's Vindicator. You can exile up to 3 cards, creature cards, from the graveyard and or from the battlefield. And then when it leaves the battlefield, they all go back to your owner's hand. So people would use Angel of Serenity sometimes to just get their opponent's creatures out of the way, but often you'd play it in like loop your own creatures, where you'd Angel of Serenity, exiling another Angel of Serenity from your graveyard, and then when it died, you get it back and do it again. Aurelia's Vindicator can kind of do some similar shenanigans, so it's definitely a super slow, grindy kind of card, but in the late game with enough mana, it can be pretty powerful. I'm really glad that Wizards mega morphed this time and added Ward 2 to the face down 2/2 creatures. Otherwise, I think they would be very unplayable in a world where right now Cut Down is the single most played card in Standard. Like 50% of decks are running face down. If you could just always kill the disguise creatures for a single mana with Cut Down or Play with Fire, really popular in red decks, you just wouldn't be able to play these cards competitively in Standard. But Ward 2 does help. It does mean that if your opponent's going to cut down your face down creature, at least they got to spend 3 mana. Play with Fire, at least they got to spend 3 mana, which makes it a lot more playable compared to how Morph would be in this Standard. I still wonder, though, exactly where this card fits. Like, it's very slow, and even once you flip it up, it still dies to Cut Down and Play with Fire. Like, yeah, you got to pay the Ward 2 still, but it's still going to die. It's still just got 2 toughness. But I could see this showing up maybe in Angels, maybe in some sort of like Rafine deck in small numbers. I do think it has a lot of power. It's just very slow slow late game power. As far as commander goes, Angel decks could take advantage of this. This is some recursion. If you're playing like Mono White Yada or something, the ability to make a bunch of mana and in the late game use this to just like eventually get a bunch of creatures back from your graveyard, or just set up the Alpha Strike where you get all the blockers out of the way, that could be really good. Big mana decks like Nykthos deck, some sort of Mono White Devotion deck could take advantage of it. So this card, it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. I'm excited for Mega Morph returning. It's a really fun mechanic. Face down creatures just lead to interesting gameplay. Just how good Aurelia's Vindicator itself is, I'm not exactly sure. We also got another Massacre Girl, and this one's pretty good. In Massacre Girl Known Killer, so a 4-mana 4/4 legendary human assassin. It is Menace. It said creatures you control have Wither, so they deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and then when a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, draw a card. So Massacre Girl, let's get the bad news out of the way first. It's not the same as original Massacre Girl. Original Massacre Girl was essentially a Wrath for like mid-range and control decks. New Massacre Girl is going to be much better as the top end of some sort of aggro deck. It is competing kind of directly with Shieldred in Standard. The cards work very differently, but they're both in that 4-drop slot in black, which is good and bad. It's bad because, well, you're going to have to beat out one of the strongest and the most expensive card in Standard to actually see a lot of play. But it's good because black is really heavily played in Standard, so there are plenty of homes for Massacre Girl. So how does this card actually play? So the idea is going to be, you're going to want to curve out with whatever, Tenacious Underdogs, Lord Skitters, Preacher of the Schism, build up a little board of creatures, then you drop Massacre Girl, and then you swing at your opponent. If your opponent blocks, all of your creatures are going to deal damage in -1/-1 counters, which means two things. First, if those creatures actually die, you'll get to draw a card with Massacre Girl. Worst case, let's say your opponent blocks your Tenacious Underdog with their Shieldred, the damage from Tenacious Underdog is going to stick around. Now the Shieldred is going to have 3 -1/-1 counters on it, so it's going to slowly eat away your opponent's board. So in a deck that's consistently attacking, I think Massacre Girl is actually an absurd top end to that deck, generating card advantage, getting through bigger blockers. It is kind of ridiculous. Also has some upside with -X, -X effects, like Virtue of Persistence. If you use that to kill a small creature, you get to draw a card with Massacre Girl. So I actually think this definitely has a home in Standard, even with Shieldred around, as the top end in aggro decks, either mono black or like Rakdos, whatever color combination. But if you're curving out and dropping this is a legit scary threat that's going to help you close out the game very quickly. Once you get back to older formats, then there's all kinds of shenanigans, like Black Sun Zenith, Contagion Engine, Toxic Deluge, Languish. These are wraths that are essentially just going to draw you a card for each creature that dies, which is kind of ridiculous. So I think Massacre Girl, you can play it as your commander. It's also good in the 99 of essentially any -1/-1 counter commander deck. The Scorpion God, Toxrill, Hapatra, Vizier Poisons. I think Massacre Girl might just end up one of the most hyped cards from the set we've seen so far. Speaking of mythics, we also got a Boros 4-drop in Agrus cost Spirit of Justice, a 4-mana Boros 2/4 legendary spirit detective. It is double strike and vigilance, and it shows off yet another new mechanic. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, choose up to 1 target creature. If it's suspected, exile it. Otherwise, suspect it. So suspect is trying to play off the murder mystery, people being suspected of the crime type of thing. So how this works, there's cards that are going to allow you to make a creature into a suspect. If a creature is a suspect, it has menace and it can't block. So the idea of this mechanic is there could be times when you want to use this on your own creature to give it menace. Often I think you're going to use it on your opponent's creature to make it so that creature can't block. Either way, it's going to help you get in more damage. It's a very aggro mechanic because both aspects of suspect are basically about letting your creatures attack more often and get through their damage. Agrus Cross itself is kind of interesting. So the big question is going to be, how often is a suspect already on the battlefield? When Agrus Cross is 4-mana ETB, exile your best thing forever, that's ridiculous. Because remember, this might look a little bit like a Fiend Hunter or something, but the card doesn't come back. If you exile something with Agrus Cross, it is just in exile. This isn't for as long as Argus Cross sticks around. This is exiled, good, gone forever, which is a huge upgrade compared to something like Fiend Hunter. So if there's often already going to be a suspect creature on your opponent's side of the battlefield, then Argus Cross is kind of an insane creature. Like 2/4 double strike means it's actually kind of like a 4/4, except it scales better with pump spells and equipment movement thanks to Double Strike, but it's got reasonable stats and it's just sniping the best thing, and if it sticks around, you can keep doing this. Like, you can attack the next turn and make something a suspect, the following turn exile it again. Very, very powerful effect, but we just don't know exactly how much suspect stuff is going to be in the set, so we gotta wait and see. It could show up definitely in some sort of like Boros aggro deck, Boros mid-range deck. We've seen like Regal Bunny Cord, super aggro Boros. We've seen Quintorius Kind, kind of more mid-rangey Boros. I think Agrus cost could definitely fit in either of those decks. It works really well with haste. I think that is the best way to build around Argus Cross. Like, let's say you play a Reckless Stormseeker, the next turn you follow it up with cost, you're going to be able to get a hasty cost. So you get the ETB, you make something a suspect, then you attack right away, exile whatever you made suspect. That's a really, really big swing. So maybe there's some sort of like Boros Stormseeker haste deck, maybe Naya with Helena and Elena partners, but I think that's the easiest way to take advantage of this. It also works with Elishnorn, doubling up the ETB. It works with Ishin, doubling up the attack triggers. So there's quite a few homes for this card. So we're going to have to wait and see just how well Suspect is supported. But if there is regularly some sus creatures on the battlefield, I think Argus Cross is actually a pretty effective removal spell. We also got a couple of weird mythics that I gotta complain about real quick. So Tomik and Melek, these are promo mythics that you will get in your pre-release packs, but they're not legal to be played in your pre-release, which is like the weirdest thing I've ever heard. So these cards are legal in Standard, in Pioneer Modern, all that kind of stuff, Commander, but they aren't legal in Limited, even though they're gonna be in your pre-release pack. So I don't know what WotC's thinking by making that choice, but the cards are kind of interesting. So Tomik, Wielder of the Law, 3 mana 2/4 Orzhov Legendary Human Advisor. It has affinity for Planeswalker, so it costs 1 less for each Planeswalker you control, which I guess means if you got a Planeswalker, you can get its cost down by a massive 1 mana. It has Flying and Vigilance, and it says whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures were attacking you and or Planeswalkers you control, that opponent loses 3 life and you draw a card. So this is like a Righteous Valkyrie stats, like 3 mana 2/4 Flying, and also Vigilance is a bonus, and maybe 2 mana if you have a Planeswalker out. That's already a pretty good body, and then you get some like Ghostly Prison style deterrent to keep your opponent from attacking you, attacking your Planeswalkers. We'll have to wait and see just how strong this card is. There are some pretty good Planeswalkers in Standard. We haven't seen like a lot of dedicated Super Friends decks, but we got Liliana of the Veil, Wandering Emperor, Ashiok, New Kaya that we'll talk about in a minute, but there's a ton of really good Planeswalkers, so maybe there's some sort of deck where this is just coming down to kind of defend your team, tax your opponent, having a decent body, and maybe even coming down on the cheap thanks to its affinity cost. So Tomik, I don't think it's busted or anything, but if you're playing a Super Friends deck in Commander, this is a nice little deterrent for your opponent to just murder all your Planeswalkers. It can even be the commander of your deck, and it could show up in Super Friends and Standard too. We also got new Melek, and this is another one of those cards. Don't put it in your pre-release deck, but it is legal everywhere else. Melek Reforged Researcher. So 5 mana star. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard times 2, so twice. And then the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs 3 less to cast. So I'm interested in this card for one reason, and that is this card can get really big in the right deck. We've seen like Crackling Drakes, Enigma Drakes, Experimental Overloads, Honeygen, all these cards that get power equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. Melek brings us to the next level because its power is double the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard, which means if you can get 10 instants or sorceries in the graveyard, then Melek's gonna be a 20/20, which means you can use like a Fling or a Thud or a Voldaren Thrillseeker or a Kella Sword Cell to just kill your opponent on the spot by throwing Melek at their face. I'm definitely gonna build this deck. This is one of the first decks I'm gonna build. I don't know how good it'll be. It is a little scary that it's a star, which means if there are no instants and sorceries in your graveyard, because your opponent like Soul Guide Lanterns you or Rest in Peace you, then Melek just straight up dies because it's got 0 power, so that is a big downside. But I think the pieces exist with like Jace Perfected Mind, Picklock Prankster. There's plenty of self-mill in Standard where you just like fill your graveyard, stick a Melek, and then for 1 mana, burn together, throw it at your opponent's face, combo kill, maybe as early as turn 6 or something. So I'm definitely excited to build this. Is a really sweet like budget Magic deck in Standard. Otherwise, I mean, I don't know, I guess it's like a fine Spell Slinger Ramp Commander, but there's like billion Izzet Spellslinger commanders, and this one I don't know, maybe an historic brawler or something, but for commander proper, there's just so many cards that are competing for the commander title in an Izzet Spellslinger deck that unless you're flinging it and throwing it in your opponent's face, I would probably play something else. We also got our Planeswalker from this set in Kaya Spirit's Justice, and this is one of the more complicated, complex Planeswalkers I think we've seen in a minute. So it's an Orzhov card. 4 mana, 3 loyalty. It has a static that says, whenever one or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile, you may choose a creature card from among them until end of turn. Target token you control becomes a copy of it, except it has flying. So essentially, when something goes to exile, you can turn a token into a copy of it. Then its abilities, +2, Surveil 2, then exile a card from the graveyard. +1, make a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. And then -2, exile target creature you control. For each other player, exile up to 1 target creature that player controls. So this card, I think it might be powerful, but I do not know what to do with it. If you look at these abilities, Surveil 2, then exile a card from the graveyard, that's some nice card selection. It might almost be equivalent to drawing a card. The +1 is, I guess, back apparition, just make a 1/1 flyer. And then the -2 removal mode is kind of like a weird Bone Splinters, like you have to exile one of your creatures, but then you get rid of one of your opponent's creatures. If you're playing Commander, one of each of your opponent's creatures. I do like how the card, it's a beautiful design. It really feeds itself very well. You have this static that wants things to go into exile from the graveyard, and then you can turn tokens into a copy of it. Its +1 makes the token that you need. Its +2 fills the graveyard and exiles from the graveyard, which will then trigger the static on the token from the +1. And then the -2 also exiles one of your creatures, so you can turn a token into a copy of it. So there's a lot of weird little synergies. I'm just not sure what this means in practice. There's plenty of token production in Standard, even outside of Gaia, that sees a lot of play. Wedding Announcements, Adeline's, Mondrax, even the new White God Osher attack. And then there's lots of ways to exile stuff from the graveyard. You get the Soul Cauldron, Lion Sash, Graveyard Trespasser. If you want to go really spicy, Dollhouse of Horrors. So I guess you like make a token, try to get a big thing in the graveyard, exile that big thing, turn the token into it. You can also do this with blink effects, Ephemerate or Lazelle's Acrobatics. So if you're blinking your stuff, that's another way you can turn a token into the copy of whatever you blinked. So the dream world here is going to be, you get down your Kaya, you have a token, you like +2, Surveyor 2, mill an Emrakul, exile an Emrakul, turn the token into Emrakul, attack your opponent, annihilate them, win the game. How realistic that is, I'm not sure. In Standard, there are some big finishers, Atalis, Atraxas, but remember, you're turning a token you already control into a copy of those creatures until end of turn. So if you turn the token into an Atali or an Atraxa, you're not getting their ETB trigger because the token's already on the battlefield. So instead, you really want to be turning the token into like something with an attack trigger, a combat damage trigger, like Gishath or Cityscape Leveler. So there's just like so many deck building intricacies that go into this card. I really don't know what to think. My guess is Kaya is one of two things. When we look back on this card in 6 months, either everyone has forgotten it existed and no one plays it and it's utterly horrible and useless, or this card is absolutely broken and there's a deck for it that can really take advantage of its abilities. And this is like one of the strongest cards from the set. It's hard for me to see a middle ground with this guy. I don't think this can just be like, it's an okay card that, you know, it rounds out my deck. This is either going to be straight up useless, straight up broken. At least that's my prediction for Kaya. So very curious, how do you build around this card? What deck would you put it in? It's a really cool design. It's just so weird and far out. We also got a new Trostani, who's apparently the bad guy in this set somehow, but Trostani 3 Whispers. So a 3 mana 4/4. It's a heavy Selesnya colors, legendary Dryad, and then it has 3 abilities. You can pay 1 and a green to give target creature Death Touch until end of turn. You can play a Selesnya Hybrid to give target creature Vigilance until end of turn, or 2 and a white to give target creature Double Strike until end of turn. And I'm not really sure what to make of this card. So on one hand, I don't think we live in the world anymore where just being a 3-mana 4/4 is exciting must-play stats. Maybe like a decade ago, seeing a Loxodon Smite or a Savage Knuckleblade, you're just like, oh my goodness, it's so big, that's gonna see play in Modern or whatever. We're not really there anymore. 3-mana 4/4 is fine, but it does have heavy color requirements. It is legendary, so I don't think that makes it a slam dunk. Its abilities actually kind of remind me of Savage Knuckleblade a little bit, and that's one of the reasons I'm a little scared of this card. Savage Knuckleblade, back in its day, was pretty hyped, and then it fell incredibly flat and didn't really see play at all. Trostani's kind of similar, where you got these 3 different abilities you can activate. There's going to be times when this is the best card on the battlefield. I think 3-mana 4/4 is good enough that you can play it, and then if it sticks around and you get to the late game and you got nothing else going on, you have this ridiculous mana sink that can take over the game. The thing is, we're entering into Clue World. I mean, we already live in an era of Magic where it's really hard to run out of cards because there's so much virtual card advantage. Everything's drawing a card with its ETB, making a clue token or whatever. So it's not like it used to be where sometimes you're just top decking and have nothing to do. So you're like, well, I guess I'm going to activate my Trostani a bunch because I have nothing else going on. That just doesn't happen as much in 2024 as it did in 2014 or whatever. So I'm not sure being a mana sink is as important as it used to be. That said, if you do have a bunch of mana in this on the battlefield, it's going to really mess with combat. Not only can you target your own creatures, but in Commander you can target your opponent's creatures. Like if Richard attacks Krim and I want Krim to die, then I can give Richard's creature double strike or whatever. The abilities are kind of expensive though. I think the dream of this card, the most powerful thing it can do, is the combination of Death's Touch and double strike on a trampling creature. So if you don't know how this works, if you give a creature Death Touch, it only has to deal 1 damage to a blocker to kill it, and then double strike gets in a ton of damage, and then trample lets you put the rest of the damage through in at your opponent. So let's say you have a Galta Stampede Tyrant somehow. You give it Death Touch, then you give it double strike for 5 total mana with Trostani, and then you attack. Your opponent blocks it, but it really doesn't matter. You deal 1 damage to each creature, the rest tramples through, you kill your opponent on the spot. So there could be some sort of deck that's built around Trostani with big trampling threats to try to take advantage of its abilities, but still, even that, like, it's 5 mana, and if you dump all your mana into it and then your opponent kills the Galta or your Ohir Chasm or whatever, then the whole plan falls apart. There are some interesting activated ability synergies in Standard. Agathos of the Vile Cauldron, Agathos Soul Cauldron, Terraining Grounds, reducing the cost of Trostani's abilities, or even better, just using Soul Cauldron to give that ability to other creatures seems really interesting. So I do think there's potential here. So we'll have to wait and see. I think Trostani, this card is probably a ridiculous bomb in Limited, like unbeatable bomb in Limited. In Constructed, I have my reservations. Savage Knuckleblade really burnt me back in the day, and I think that Trostani might be similar. It's another card too that needs to really sit on the battlefield for probably several turns, and you have to have a ton of mana to really get value out of it, so I'm a little skeptical it'll really take off in Constructed, but it's a 3-mana 4/4 with a bunch of text, so it's worth keeping in mind at least. Moving into the world of rares, we kick things off with a full 10-card rare land cycle in the Surveil Lands. So these lands, ETB tapped. When they ETB, you get to surveil one, but they have land type. So like Raucous Theater, it's a swamp mountain, so they're fetchable, all those shenanigans. Very curious to see what people think of these cards. So on one hand, a decade ago, the Temples, the Scrylands, actually saw a decent amount of play in Commander and even in Standard. These are a huge upgrade over the Temples. On the other hand, they are always going to enter the battlefield tapped, so I don't think they quite get to like the shock land tier. That said, there's only so many dual lands that have the land types. I run into this in Commander all the time, where I'm trying to build a Commander deck, and I want a couple more fetchable dual lands, and I end up playing the bicycle lands, the like pay 2 to cycle lands. I think these are probably better than those cycling lands. Like, if you're going to be getting an ETB tapped land anyway, I think these are probably some of the best ones you can tutor up. Also hilarious about these lands, I think it just makes the best deck in Standard even better. So right now in Standard, Domain is the #1 deck, and I think that Wizards, when they design this set, I bet they expected that the Triomes would have rotated already, because remember they canceled rotation last year. So when they were designing Murders at Karlov Manor, WotC was thinking, okay, like the Triomes rotated a couple of months ago, we got this domain mechanic that's still in standard, we probably need some lands to support that archetype. Well, it turns out they canceled rotation, so the Triomes stick around, and Domain's the best deck in the format, and now Domain also gets a whole nother dual land cycle with the land types that even lets them surveil if you throw in some reanimation synergies or whatever. So I think these lands are very good. I don't think they'll see a ton of play in formats like Standard or in Pioneer just because they ETB tapped, but I'm definitely excited to play these as really solid budget dual lands in Commander where the land types are really big, and I also think they'll serve a role in Standard. Dual lands always do, although I think they're gonna be more important once we actually get the rotation of the Triomes, but I'm really curious what you think about these lands. How good do you rank them? What tier do they fit in? Are you gonna play them in Standard, Commander, other formats? Definitely let me know in the comments, because I'm still trying to figure these ones out. Next up, we got a new Teysa in Teysa Opulent Oligarch. So 3 mana 2/3 legendary human advisor. It does have Death Touch, which is good. It says at the beginning of your end step, investigate for each opponent who lost life this turn, and then when a clue you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this card to me, I think is mostly a Commander card. I was thinking about it for Standard, and compared to something like Preacher of the Schism, and it just looks so bad. Like, Preacher of the Schism has better stats, it's not legendary, so you can stack them up. You don't need to spend mana to crack a clue to get card advantage out of it, or spend mana to sack a clue to get tokens out of it. It just kind of does that all for free. So I think that Teysa is probably a non-starter for Standard. In Commander, it's kind of interesting. So the biggest upside of Teysa in Commander is the way its first ability is worded. At the beginning of your end step, investigate for each opponent who lost life this turn. That means that if you can hit each opponent each turn cycle, you're going to get 3 clues each turn cycle. And then the last ability, I know it has the hated once each turn restriction, but remember, in Commander, you have a bunch of opponents' turns, and you can crack clues at instant speed. So if you can make 3 clues, you can crack one during your turn, one during the next player's turn, one during the next player's turn, and get a token out of each of them. So I think in Commander, this is actually a cute little card advantage engine, but in Standard, it's pretty much just a bad version of Preacher of the Schism. As far as specific Commander homes, the couple I've seen that people seem hype about is like Thales really cares about tokens being created, Will the Wise cares about clues being created. So if you have some synergies for tokens or clues that goes up in value, I guess you could play it as your Commander as sort of like Temna at home, I guess, where you gotta like spend a bunch of mana to crack the clues to get the card advantage. But I think you'd probably just play Temna, at least from a competitive perspective. So Teysa, it's okay, but more of a Commander card than a Standard card. We also got probably my favorite card from the set so far, one of my favorite cards from the set, in Kylox Visionary Inventor. So this card, I am under no illusion that it is good. I don't think it's actually good, but boy is it going to be fun. So 7 mana 4/4 Legendary Machino Artifactor. It has Menace, Ward 2, and Haste, and then most importantly it says, when it attacks, sack any number of other creatures and exile the top X cards of your library, where X is their total power. You can cast any number of instants or sorcery cards from among the exiled cards without paying their mana cost. So this card seems like it is just going to lead to the biggest, most spectacular turn that I can imagine. You just like play some high toughness creatures, play this with haste, sack all your stuff, and get like this huge epic experiment essentially, where you're hoping that the spells that you hit off of Kylox is just going to win you the game on the spot. So it is 7 mana. You need a lot of setup to really make it work, which is why I think it's probably not competitive. And then I guess you could still whiff theoretically. Like you could cast 20 cards from the top of your library, or go 20 cards deep into your library and just not hit the right things to actually win the game on the spot. So there's a bunch of reasons why it's probably not going to be super competitive, but good lord, is that just like such a spectacular turn where you play this, cross your fingers, sack your board, and hope that Kylox is going to win you the game. So as far as Standard is concerned, this is actually another card that works really well with Melek, where you just like cast cast some spells, make a huge Melek, maybe a huge Honeyjin, so you'd only need a couple creatures on the battlefield, and they're just going to have massive power, and then you Kylox, you sack your stuff, and try to hit enough explosive singularities to just burn your opponent out. Or you could also go another direction and play like young pyromancers, monastery mentors, things that make tokens when you cast instants or sorceries. Then you still do the same thing of sacking your Meleks and Honeyjins, and then you just try to cast a whole bunch of spells, make a huge board of monk tokens or whatever, and win the game that way. So I really like the explosive turns that this card offers, but at 7 mana, it's definitely more of like a fun card than something I think is going to break standard, although I hope it breaks standard, because that would actually be pretty sweet if Kylox was like a real deck in standard. We also got one of my favorite cards from the set in Warleader's Call. So Warleader's Call, 3 mana Boros enchantment. It says creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever a creature enters a battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So why is this card exciting? So this is essentially Glorious Anthem mixed with Impact Tremor. So we have many Glorious Anthem effects. That's not a big deal. You can find one of those if you want one. The exciting part is the Impact Tremors mode. So Impact Tremors, the ability to, when a creature ETBs, deal a damage to your opponents, that's a really powerful effect to enable certain combos. The problem is it's very narrow. If you're not comboing with Impact Tremors, you can't really put it in your deck because it's just not going to do enough. But in Impact Tremors, that is also a Glorious Anthem, suddenly allows you to have an Impact Tremors effect in your deck and still play fairly, even if you're not going infinite. So as far as combos, the easiest way to go infinite with Warleader's Call is just any infinite creature ETB combo. So like Felidar Guardian, Wisp-Weaver Angel, they can blink each other an infinite number of times. If you do that with a Warleader's Call out, you're just going to burn the table out of the game. Or like Avenger of Zendikar, Mystic Reflection. You Avenger of Zendikar, Mystic Reflection turns all the tokens it would make into more Avenger of Zendikars, which make more tokens, and then you just burn the table out of the game. Or the classic Mirror Retriever Heartless Summoning, where you can loop 2 Mirror Retrievers forever for free from your graveyard. With the cost reduction from Heartless Summoning, Warleader's Call just wins you the game. So all of these combos are combos that Impact Tremors would work in as a finisher if you wanted it to. The upside is Warleader's Call does something when you're not comboing. We've even seen these combos in standard. We just played the Infinite God combo where like Invasion of Amonkhet on one of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan gods lets you infinitely sack the god because of the way things are worded. The backside of Invasion of Amonkhet copies the god and it comes back, but not as a land, but as the god, and you get infinite ETB triggers. So Warleader's Call would be a finisher for that as well. But I think the most exciting part about this is an Impact Tremors that you can play in a fair deck. So like in standard, we have this Boros, Aggro, Regal Bunnycorn, Gleeful Demolition deck. We also have it in like Pioneer. That's a deck where Warleader's Call seems absurdly powerful, but you couldn't really play Impact Tremors. Impact Tremors would be great in the deck, but it's just gonna not do enough in some situations. But the fact that Warleader's Call is always turning your Gleeful Demolition tokens into 2/2s, your Regal Bunnycorn is getting a little bit of a buff, your Sanguine Evangelist is getting a bit of a buff. It's always doing that, and then it's also going to work like Impact Tremors, suddenly makes this really exciting. I actually think that the Boros aggro deck in standard jumps up like maybe a full tier because of this card, because now you have this way to close out the game when things go wrong. Like the Boros aggro deck, really aggro, very good at getting in fast damage, but when things go wrong, it has a hard time actually closing out the game because you're drawing a bunch of Gleeful Demolitions and 1/1 Bunnycorns after a sweeper. But with Warleader's Call out, then your Gleeful Demolition is hitting your opponent's face for 3. You don't actually have to attack with the tokens. All your other creatures are as well. So I think that's a really nice home for that card. Plus, if you're playing Impact Tremors in any combo in any format, and you're in the right colors, I think that Warleader's Call is just a strict upgrade. So actually really excited about this card because it just takes this powerful but niche effect and makes it much more broadly applicable. We also got a new Judith, and Judith Carnage Connoisseur. So 5 mana 3/4 legendary human shaman says when you cast an instant or sorcery spell, choose one. That spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink, or create a 2/2 red imp creature token. With when this creature dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So first, this isn't a standard card. 5 mana is just so much. Not only do you need to get to 5 mana, you need to get to 5 mana, then you need more mana, and you need instants or sorceries in your hand, and your reward is probably making an imp or 2. So it is a really strong card. Like, if you can untap with this with a handful of instants and sorceries, and like sling a bunch of spells, it's probably going to win you the game, but I don't think at 5 mana it's quite good enough for standard. If there's any chance this works in 60 card formats, it's probably going to be to combo with like End the Festivities Festivities, where you get up to 6 mana, you Judith, and the Festivities, give it Death Touch, one-sided, 1 mana Wrath that also pings your opponent for 1. That's actually pretty exciting, so maybe there's some way to like make that work, but my thinking is this is mostly a Commander card. That's where I think this is really going to shine, and in Commander, this card is legit exciting, because this is Rakdos Spellslinger, and Rakdos Spellslinger is a pretty under-supported color combination. We were talking before about how, like, when I see it, is it Spellslinger Commander, I'm mostly like, meh, okay, there's like 40 of these out there, like, what does this new one even matter? Because there's just so much competition. Rakdos, on the other hand, if you want to Spellsling in Rakdos, you're probably playing Torowaki or maybe Mayor of the Magic Strings, but there's not a lot of options, and even the options we do have are not, like, that good. I think that Judith becomes immediately the most exciting default Rakdos Spellslinger commander, and it can do some really spicy things in Commander. So the most exciting thing, I think, is this can combo kill kind of like Firesong and Sunspeaker. So if you take a Blasphemous Act, let's say, or Star of Extinction, these mass damage sweepers, and you give them lifelink, you're going to gain 13 with Blasphemous Act or 20 with Star of Extinction life for each creature on the battlefield. So in a game of Commander, it's pretty easy that Judith Blasphemous Act is going to gain you like 200 life or something ridiculous. Star of Extinction probably going to gain you like 400 life, just huge numbers. So that by itself is pretty exciting. You're combining your Commander with some really playable cards anyway, and then throw in like a Aetherflux Reservoir or something to actually close out the game. So even that's really sweet. You can also do the same standard trick using the mini sweepers with Death Touch. There's also some cards that like are really powerful, but their drawback is they deal a ton of damage to you. Judith gets around that and actually makes these cards insane. So like Command the Dreadhorde, 6 mana, choose any number of target creatures or planeswalker cards in graveyards, not just your graveyard, any graveyard. Command the Dreadhorde deals damage to you equal to their mana cost, and then you put them on the battlefield. So normally Command the Dreadhorde can reanimate a couple of things and you take a bunch of damage, so you can't really go too far. With the Judith out though, and they curve into each other perfectly, you can Command the Dreadhorde literally every creature and planeswalker from every graveyard, give Command the Dreadhorde lifelink, so then the damage that you're dealt is essentially counteracted. Sure, you take a bunch of damage, but you gain it back thanks to lifelink, so you just get to reanimate literally everything for 6 mana, like the best Rise of the Dark Realms ever. Also really cute, like Madcap Experiment. Madcap Experiment can tutor some busted artifact onto the battlefield at random from your library, but you take a ton of damage. So normally you can't play this in most decks because there's a risk that you just kill yourself trying to find what you want. But with the Judith out, you can do the same trick where the damage is going to be counteracted because of the lifelink, or you can even play like Judith Madcap Experiment in a single artifact in your deck and know that you'd get it every time with no risk of losing your life thanks to the lifelink from Judith. So Judith, I wish it was like 1 less mana, maybe, yeah, 1 less mana. If 4 mana, I'd be kind of hyped about this card in Standard. If 5 mana, I think it's probably like a little sketchy for 60 card formats, but this is going to be one of the coolest new commanders to build around from the set at a minimum, and who knows, maybe we can find a way to break it in Standard. We also got Axebane Ferox showing up another new mechanic in Collect Evidence. So Axebane Ferox, 4 mana 4/4, it's a beast with Death Touch and Haste, and then it has Ward of Collect Evidence 4. So what is Collect Evidence? It's essentially a fixed version of Delve, sort of. So Collect Evidence means exile at least that mana value worth of cards from your graveyard. So if your opponent wants to target your Axebane Ferox, they have to cast the spell, they have to have at least 4 mana value worth of cards in their graveyard, and they have to exile them, or else that spell's going to be countered. There's a bunch of other uses for Collect Evidence. We'll see some more of these cards as we go along, but I think Axebane Ferox is kind of intriguing. So it's kind of like a Uvenwald oddity. You give up Trample for Death Touch, which is probably fine. So if you want to play multiples of these effects, there's just like Hasty, Smash Hit for 4 drops, you can play both of them. The other intriguing part of Axebane Ferox is with a bit of work, you can kind of like build your own hexproof. Like if you play a Rest in Peace, so no cards can be in the graveyard, your opponent will never be able to collect evidence, which means they'll never be able to target your Axebane Ferox, which means you literally have a 4/4 hexproof Death Touch Haster for 4, and then you just load it up with auras or whatever and go on to win the game. So probably a little bit too janky to have a 2-card combo to build hexproof, but still kind of a neat idea. So Axebane Ferox, I mean, Uvenwald oddities in Standard and it's not breaking anything, so I don't think this breaks anything either, but it is a cool design. Speaking of collecting evidence. We also have Analyze the Pollen. So 1 mana sorcery is an additional cost to cast it. You can collect evidence 8, so exile at least 8 mana value worth of stuff from your graveyard. And then you get to search your library for a basic land, but if evidence is collected, you get to instead search your library for a creature or any land, reveal the card, put it in your hand, then shuffle. If this card looks familiar, it's basically a twist on Traverse the Uvenwald. Traverse the Uvenwald, literally exactly the same card, except rather than collecting evidence 8 to turn on the tutor for any creature or land, you need Delirium. You need 4 different card types in your graveyard. And I've actually been going back and forth on which of these is better, and it probably depends on the format in the deck. So my first thought was, okay, so this is just like a very fixed and safer version of Traverse the Uvenwald, because Traverse the Uvenwald, in a format like Modern, you can turn it on pretty quickly by like Mishra's Bauble, artifact in the graveyard, Verdant Catacombs, land in the graveyard, cast a Thoughtseize, sorcery in the graveyard. So it's pretty easy to like by turn 2, turn on Traverse the Uvenwald. It's gonna be more challenging to do that with Analyze the Pollen. You can still do it, but the cards you gotta play are a lot different. These cheap spells with no mana value aren't really gonna do anything for you. For Analyze the Pollen, what you really want is expensive cards that can put themselves in the graveyard. So this really synergizes with like the land cyclers that we got in Lord of the Rings, like Lorien Revealed. 1 mana cycle at Get an Island, and that's 5 mana value in your graveyard. That gets you more than halfway to Analyzing the Pollen on turn 1. Or like Magma Opus on turn 2. Magma Opus, pitch it to make a treasure. That's an 8 mana value card in your graveyard. You can immediately sack the treasure, Analyze the Pollen, tutor up whatever you want, have it in your hand, ready to go to the next turn. So there are ways to turn this on really quickly if you want to build around it. So I'm actually like on the fence now. I'm going back and forth. At first I thought, okay, this is bad Traverse the Uvenwald. Now I'm like, it's just different Traverse the Uvenwald. And there's going to be some decks that can really harness the power of this card and make it really, really good. The other thing is, in the late game, having 8 mana value of stuff in your graveyard is going to be pretty easy for most decks. So we're mostly focused on how do you do this really quickly. In the late game, it's just going to happen naturally. So I think this card might actually be pretty powerful. Like, you really do want to turn on the collect evidence. 1 mana to get a basic. Lay of the Land, not really a playable card, but if you can turn this on consistently, it does add a lot of consistency to your deck. We also got a new Krenko in Krenko, Baron of Tin Street. So 3 mana 3/3 legendary goblin, of course. It has haste. You can tap it, sack an artifact to put a +1/+1 counter on each goblin you control. And then whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you can pay 1. If you do, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. It gains haste until end of turn. So Krenko is pretty interesting. Krenko is the most iconic goblin commander, but this version of Krenko is a lot different than we've seen in the past. This is a Krenko that really cares about artifacts. It actually really specifically wants you to have a bunch of treasure production in your deck. This is a cool callback to goblins of the past. If you go back to like Mirrodin era, there was actually a pretty strong artifact sub-theme to goblins, like Slowbad Goblin Tinkerer, Carrot Clan Stoker. We even see Goblin Engineer from Modern Horizons kind of calling back to that. So this is one of those artifact goblins. Krenko, it doesn't just want you to have a bunch of goblins in your deck. That's not really going to do anything. You need a bunch of goblins and a bunch of artifacts. The good news is this combos absurdly well with treasure production. So think of Dockside Extortionates, let's say. You play it and you make like 10 treasure tokens. The last ability on Krenko is absurd with treasures. Whenever an artifact goes to a graveyard, you can pay 1 red mana and make a hasty goblin. So that essentially means you crack a treasure to make a red, and using that red mana, you pay for Krenko's ability and make a hasty goblin. So every treasure you control can turn into a hasty 1/1. And then you can maybe sacrifice your last treasure to put counters on all them and just kill everyone on the spot. So if you can make enough treasures from Docksides and Fable the Mirror Breakers or Wily Goblins or whatever, Krenko can just kill the entire table all at once. I'm mostly thinking Commander here. I'm not sure this is something that can really work in Standard. We don't have enough goblins, and then the goblins decks that exist in like Historic and Modern and Legacy just don't have enough artifacts to make it work. This would have to create a brand new archetype, which maybe it could if there's a way to go infinite with that last mode that I haven't figured out yet, but I think this is mostly a Commander card. It also is kind of cute with Skirk Prospector. So artifacts go to the graveyard, pay 1, make a goblin, and then Skirk Prospector lets you sack the goblins to make a red mana to get back that mana that you spent. So there's probably some sweet like aristocrat style loop here where you're like dealing damage as your goblins enter the battlefield, maybe with the new Impact Tremors type card, and then you're sacking them to deal more damage from a Blood Artist type effect, and just like going off and winning the game. So I think that's a really sweet option. There's also literal infinites. The problem with the literal infinites that I found, like Pitiless Plunder, Phyrexian Altar. So if you can get like Krenko, Pitiless Plunder, Phyrexian Altar on the battlefield, you just go like fully infinite. Pitiless Plunder, when a creature you control dies, you make a treasure. So you can have, let's say, a treasure. Then you sack the treasure to Krenko. You use the mana from the treasure to activate Krenko to make a goblin. Then you sacrifice the goblin to Phyrexian Altar to make a mana. When that dies, it'll trigger Pitiless Plunder to make a treasure, which then you can sacrifice to Krenko to make a goblin and loop it. Infinite creatures, EP being infinite mana, just go off. The only issue with this is Pitiless Plunder is a black card, so you can't play it if Krenko's your literal commander. But if you're playing a Rakdos Goblin deck, especially some Treasury Rakdos Goblin deck, this is a nice little backdoor combo from the 99 in your commander deck. Also just hilarious with Bootlegger Stash, Krenko Bootlegger Stash, and this is even in standard right now. Essentially just means your lands have tap, make a hasty 1/1 red goblin. You tap the land to make a treasure, sack the treasure, Krenko triggers, pay the 1 from the treasure to make the goblin, do it again. So I don't know if this would actually be competitive, but it is kind of a funny against the odds deck. All my lands make goblins or something would be a pretty sweet video. So Krenko, this is not as busted as some past Krenkos, but if you're willing to build around it and embrace its artifacty nature, I think it can actually be a pretty strong goblin combo style commander. We also got Homicide Investigator, which honestly just makes me sad with the number of restrictions on it. So 2 mana 2/2 Human Detective. It says whenever 1 or more non-token creatures you control die, investigate. This ability only triggers once each turn. So when I first saw this card, I was like, okay, it's Morbid Opportunist, except the downside is you gotta spend mana to crack the clue to get the card, but you get the upside of it being 1 less mana, so it's probably okay, even despite the once per turn restriction. Because when Morbid Opportunist was first printed, I was pretty skeptical of it just because of the once per turn thing, but really drawing 1 extra card per turn is still fine. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized, wait, Homicide Investigator actually has like a million more restrictions compared to Morbid Opportunist. Morbid Opportunist triggers on any creature dying. Homicide Investigator only cares about your creatures dying, so it's already another restriction. And then Morbid Opportunist cares about any creature dying, while Homicide Investigator cares about non-token creatures dying. So you can't even like play this in an Oni called Anvil deck where you're sacrificing the constructs or something. So when I add all that together, I think I've come to the conclusion that Homicide Investigator just has way too many restrictions on it to actually be a very good card. I mean, maybe it's still fine, but boy, there are just layers and layers of hoops to jump through to actually make this card do what you want. And even if it does do what you want, your reward is you get a clue each turn that then you have to spend 2 mana to crack to actually get the card out of. So I don't know, maybe if there's some detective deck or something, but otherwise I think it's probably not quite good enough. We also got Sharp-Eyed Rookie. So 2 mana 2/2 Human Detective. It has Vigilance. It says when a creature ETBs under your control, if its power is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's power, or its toughness is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's toughness, put a +1/+1 counter on it and then investigate. So this is kind of the return of Evolve. We actually have a whole mechanic about when a creature with greater power enters the battlefield, put a counter on it. We already have this. It's Evolve. Gyre's Age, Shamble Shark. There's many of these cards. So Sharp-Eyed Rookie is essentially like an unkeyworded version of Evolve, with the upside that you get to make a treasure whenever you evolve it. So it's got a little tireless tracker mixed in. Very curious if this card's going to be good enough. So the best Evolve cards we've seen are the 1 mana ones. Like Pelt Collector was really good. Sharp-Eyed Rookie starts at 2 mana, it only has 2 power. It can snowball, but it's going to be hard to snowball it too far because as its power and toughness grow, it becomes harder and harder to play a creature bigger than it to trigger it. But really, if you can play this and like make 2 clues and make it a 4/4, that's still probably good enough. That's still pretty powerful, so I think there could be a deck for it. Plus, remember, we do have some weird green artifact synergies in Standard, like Teething Wormlet. Sir Ginger works really well in the green shell because of the support, so maybe there's a deck that just really cares about the clue ETBing, and you can build some, like, weird artifact clue aggro deck, with Sharp-Eyed Rookie being one of the engines that keep the deck running. So I don't think this card's busted or anything, but I think it's close enough that you could see play in Standard. We also got No Witnesses, and this is another one of those cards that I think was like Wizards not knowing that rotation was going to be canceled. So 4 mana sorcery, each player who controls the most creatures investigates, and then destroy all creatures. So this is essentially Depopulate. Depopulate was supposed to have rotated by now, but then they canceled rotation, so now we have No Witnesses, which probably was intended to replace Depopulate, but now we just got both of them, and we also have Sunfall, and we also have Farewell. Maybe this is the best Wrath if you're an aggro deck, because if you have the most creatures when you're Wrathing, which normally if you have the most creatures, you probably don't want to be Wrathing, but if for some reason you do get the clue out of it. But I think this was intended to be the 4 mana Wrath Depopulate replacement, but then Depopulate never went away, so we just get another extra Wrath. We also got a pretty sweet reprint in Assassin's Trophy. So this one, you probably know what it does. 2 mana instant, destroy a permanent opponent controls. Its controller can search the library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. This card, really good last time it was in Standard, still sees play all the way back to Modern. Yes, it's kind of a bummer that you give your opponent a land out of the deal, but the flexibility of blowing up literally anything, I think, means this should be a pretty good card in Standard. At worst, a sideboard card. We already have good Golgari decks in the format that it would fit right into, but the option to have like a single card in your sideboard that can get rid of Shieldred, or a Leyline Binding, or a Cavern of Souls, or a Eternal Wanderer, that's a really, really valuable thing. So speaking of value, price-wise, it's like $7 or $8, so a good reprint, not a like absurd $50, oh my goodness reprint, but a solid reprint. It sees Modern play, really nice card that will see play in Standard, and I'm glad we're getting more of them, because I imagine as it doesn't get reprinted, it'd probably start creeping up in price. We also got Kelln number 2 in Kelln Inquisitive Protege. So 4 mana, 3/4, but actually it's an adventure card. So the adventure side, 2 Simic mana sorcery, investigate, and you can play an additional land this turn. And then its creature side, a 4 mana human fairy detective. It's a 3/4 with flying and vigilance. It says whenever it attacks, destroy up to 1 target artifact. If you controlled that artifact, you get to draw a card. So Kelln Inquisitive Protege, I'm very curious about how good this card is. So it's adventure mode, Tail the Suspect. It's essentially like a bad Growth Spiral. It's a Growth Spiral, but you don't get the card draw right away. It's also sorcery speed, but you don't get the card draw right away. It's a Growth Spiral, but you gotta pay 2 extra mana if you want to draw the card. Maybe there's some world this is an upside against like Shieldred, so you can still ramp, but you don't get burned by Shieldred. But really, it's a worse version of Growth Spiral. And then the creature side, it kind of intrigues me. So 4 mana, 3/4 flying vigilance. Fine stats, not like absurd stats, but fine stats. And then when it attacks, you essentially do a Frenzied Trap Breaker, the backside of Outland Liberator, where you get to blow up an artifact. If your opponent has a good artifact, you just blow it up, get it off the battlefield. If your opponent doesn't have something you have to blow up, then you can always blow up one of your own clues or bloods or treasures and get some card advantage out of it. So I think that Kelln, the big deal here is going to be the ramp mode. So we've seen like Topiary Stomper be really good in the domain decks. Maybe this can join Stomper. I don't know if the domain decks have enough room, but they do play a lot of lands, and making an extra land drop, getting a clue that you can crack in the future when you have the time, and then having a creature that'll come down presumably the following turn. And that's another important thing to remember about this card, is the front side curves into the back side. If you hit the extra land drop off Tail the Suspect, you get to play Kelln on turn 3 and start the snowball going. And then remember that thing about like, oh, I gotta spend mana to crack my clue. Well, that doesn't matter much once you have Kelln, because when Kelln attacks, it can just blow up the clue and let you draw a card with it without having to spend any mana to crack it. That's what you really want to do with this card. So maybe this can show up in the domain decks. I'm also just excited about trying a ramp deck with this card. We have Glimpse the Core, now we have Kelln as another 2-mana ramp spell. Maybe we can just mash all this together and ramp into Nissas or Atraxas or one with the multiverses and build some sort of like 4-color or Simic ramp deck with Kelln. But I actually think Kelln is really good. We saw the first time we had adventures, think of Brazen Borrower and Bone Crusher Giant, that the very best adventure creatures are ones where you play the spell and the next turn you can play the creature. Kelln is technically one of those. Yeah, there's a bit of risk that if you cast the adventure mode and you don't have an extra land drop, you're not really going to get any value out of it. That is a little bit of a concern, but in theory, you should be able to tail the suspects onto Kelln on turn 3 and start the snowball going, and that's exactly what the best adventure cards in the history of Magic have done. So I think that Kelln might actually end up being a little bit underrated, at least at first, but I think this card could be pretty decent. We also got a new Izoni, an Izoni Center of the Web. So 6 mana 5/4, legendary elf detective. It is Menace. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can collect evidence 4. So exile at least 4 mana value worth of stuff from your graveyard. If you do, you make 2/2/1 black and green spider creature tokens with Menace in reach. So essentially Lolth tokens, more or less, if you remember Lolth. And then you can sack 4 tokens, surveil 2, draw 2 cards, then gain 2 life. So Izoni, I don't know. I feel like this card might actually be kind of reasonable. Last time we had Izoni, it was kind of bad, but it was a 6 mana 2/3. This is only a little bit more buff. If you play this and you are able to collect evidence, you're getting a total of 9 power across 3 bodies, plus some of it has some keywords, Menace and Reach, and then you also have the ability to maybe use Izoni to sacrifice some stuff to draw some cards in the future. It seems like that could be a thing that you could play at the top end of some sort of like Blossoming Tortoise deck. You're already filling the graveyard with Blossoming Tortoise. You're already ramping with Blossoming Tortoise. We already have it in Golgari Shells. I don't think Izoni would be a 4 of, but I mean, this has a really strong ETB trigger, right? This comes down and just floods the board with power. It'll rebuild easily after a Wrath. Yeah, it's a little awkward that Farewell's the thing and can exile your graveyard, but discounting that, I could see this being like a nice 1 of or 2 of at the top end of your mid-rangey curve to just make a huge board full of tokens and take over the game. In Commander, I think this is mostly a card for spider decks. If you're playing like Shelob or Ishkana or some deck that cares about spiders, this is another good spider creating card. And spiders can use all the help they can get because they just haven't had that much support over the first 30 years of Magic. So anytime you see a card that is actually like pretty decent and makes spiders, it's probably going to go in your spider commander deck. I guess you could also play Izoni as your commander, but I think it would be more fun probably to play it in Shelob or Ishkana. If I was going to play it as my commander, I'd probably really go hard on the token theme because that last mode, sack 4 tokens, surveil 2, draw a card, gain 2, draw 2 cards in game 2, that's actually not restricted in any way. So if you can stack up enough doubling seasons and so forth, there's probably a way that you can use that to more or less just draw through your entire deck in a turn. We also got a new Tolsamir in Tolsamir Midnight's Light. So 5 mana 3/2 Elf Scout as lifelink. When it ETBs, you create Voja Fenstalker, a legendary 5/5 green and white wolf creature token with trample. And then when a wolf you control attacks, if Tolsamir also attacked, target creature an opponent controls, block that wolf this combat if able. So Tolsamir, my first thought was something's wrong with our Tolsamir progression, because our first Tolsamir made a 2/2 legendary Voja, then our second one made a 3/3 legendary Voda, and now we skipped up to a 5/5 legendary Volda. Where's my 4/4 Volja wizard? Seriously, you gotta pay attention to these details. There's something wrong with the progression of these Tolsamirs. The 4/4 is missing. But really, I think this card might actually be pretty good. It reminds me a little bit of like Priest of the Blood Rites or the infamous Armano Worm, where it's just like a body that makes another really big body. It's a 5-drop that comes along with a 5/5. But what really sold me on this card, because I was ready to be like, okay, like Priest of the Blood Rite wasn't really good enough. Armada Worm was pretty good, but it makes way more power than Tolsamir. What sold me on this was actually the last mode. The cool part of this card is if you Tolsamir and make Voja and you get to attack with them, you can use the wolf to make like a Shieldred block it and die, or a Fiend block it, whatever annoying thing your opponent has. So it actually kind of turns into a removal spell in a weird way, where if you're attacking with the wolf token, you get to choose what's going to die to that wood token blocking, and that also should help your Tolsamir actually be able to get in combat damage as well. So the removal aspect of it, I think, makes it a lot better than it looks at first glance. The other thing I like about this is it's kind of like a wolf commander, right? So it says whenever a wolf you control attacks, if it attacked as well, target creature an opponent controls blocks that wolf. So if you attack with a bunch of wolves, you get to make your opponent block all those wolves however you want, and probably just like wrath their board every single turn. We have tons and tons of support for werewolves, but we don't have that much support for just literal wolves. So Tolsimir is the perfect way if you want to play your Tovolar Huntmaster, not because it's a werewolf, but because it makes wolf tokens, or like Wolfiller Silverheart, or Cassage Cagebreakers, or Howl of the Night Pact. It seems like the perfect commander to build a wolf tribal deck, which is something we could use more of. So I actually kind of like Tolsimir. I think it could have a chance in Standard. Awkward that it doesn't work with Panharmonicons because the token's legendary, but the fact that the wolf turns into removal is a pretty big upside. We also have one more new mechanic to look at in cases. So our rare case so far is Case of the Ransacked Lab. So let's read the card real quick, and then I'll explain it because I know people were confused by this. So 3 mana, says instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and then it says to salve, you've cast 4 or more instants and sorcery spells this turn. If unsalved, salve at the beginning of your next end step, and then salved whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. So this card, if you don't know what a case is, looks really confusing, but it's actually not that bad. Think of cases as essentially sagas with a quest built into them is probably the easiest way to conceptualize them. So how this card works, you play it, it's a 3-mana enchantment that has a static ability. Your instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast. Then, if you have a turn where you cast 4 or more instants and sorcery spells in a turn, you salve the case, and on your end step, you get the last mode, the salved mode, and then you're going to have an enchantment that not only is the first mode, instants and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast, but also, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get to draw a card. So that's basically how it works. You always get the first mode of the case. Once you do the middle thing on the case, on the next end step, you'll also get the salved mode on the case, and that ends up being a pretty powerful card. Like 3 mana, reduce the cost of your instants and sorceries by 1, and draw a card whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. That is really, really strong, but you do have to salve it to actually get the full reward. So this is essentially like a 3 mana brawl with the upside of being enchantment, so it's less likely to die, with a, I want you to do a mini storm off thing, kind of like Arclight Phoenix, where you gotta cast 4 spells in a turn to actually salve it, and then your reward is you get an Archmage Emeritus, also with the upside of being on enchantment, so it's less likely to die. The combination, the full mode of this is actually a very strong effect. Reducing the cost of your instants and sorceries and drawing every time you cast one is going to allow for some really big turns. So I think this card could have a role in Standard. There's this like blue-white Spellslinger deck floating around. Also just like mono-blue Haughty Djinn could play it, where you'll take advantage of the cost reduction of the first side. And then you get a bunch of cheap cantrips, removal spells that you can use to salve it. And then once you get the backside, it's going to be incredibly hard to run out of action because every spell you cast is also drawing you a card. Imagine your Make Disappear having a kicker of draw a card, or your Get Lost, a kicker of draw a card. That's what Case of the Ransacked Lab offers. So I think there's homes for it in Standard. In older formats, 3 mana is a little bit tough. You have Literal Balaral, Goblin Electromancer, if you want a cost reduction effect, but I could see maybe like Pioneer Arclight Phoenix, or a Thing in the Ice Spellslinger style deck, maybe using this, it works in the sideboard. I imagine that part of the value of this card is it does the cost reduction thing right away to support your primary game plan, and then once you salve it, it gives you this backup plan, where if things go wrong, your opponent deals with your Thing in the Ice, or your Arclight, well, I guess I draw a bunch of cards and try to reassemble my combo, try to reassemble my threats and win the game. I think this is also just like one of the easiest auto-includes I've seen in Spellslinger Commander decks. It's going to be at its best in Spellslinger decks. They're trying to cast a bunch of spells in a turn rather than a couple of big spells, but that's most Spellslinger decks. But imagine this in like Niv Mizzet Perun, where whenever you draw a card, this is going to ping. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. With a Case of the Ransacked Lab out fully, you're getting that discount and you're drawing 2 cards every spell. You're probably just going to storm off and win the game on the spot. So I think this is actually a very powerful effect, and I gotta give a shout out to the case mechanic. I really like it. I think it's really cool to have these little mini quests, and I think it's going to be super fun for deck building. So if we want to build like a Case of the Ransacked Lab deck, our focus is going to be like, how can we solve this as quickly as possible, which I think is what Wizards is going for. So I think there's going to be a ton of these really sweet little deck building challenges built into these cases, and I think it's going to lead for really fun deck building and hopefully fun gameplay too. We also got all 10 of the special guest reprints from the slot. So special guests, you can find these in play boosters or in collector boosters. If you open one in your draft, you can play them, but they're not standard legal. Outside of Magic Arena, like Historic and Timeless, some of these cards being new there, what formats these cards are legal in doesn't change. So if a card was only Legacy legal, like Show and Tell, it's still only Legacy legal, but Crashing Footfalls, Modern legal, so you can play it in Modern. So essentially just a reprint slot. I think what I'm most excited about from these cards, outside of just some decent reprints like Show and Tell and Gamble and Field of the Dead, is some of these cards are going to be new to Arena and could have a pretty big impact on Timeless or on Historic. So Wizards did say when they announced special guests in Timeless that there might be some times where they like don't put all these cards on Arena. Their goal is to put them all on there, but I think they use the example of like, well, what if we do a Mana Crypt special guest? We might not actually want that to be legal in Timeless or Historic, so we would replace it. I haven't heard WotC say anything about replacing any of these cards, but if I missed it, definitely let me know. But based on what we know right now, Show and Tell, I think, will definitely have an impact on Timeless. We've already seen Sneak Attack and Natural Order. We just played a Sneak Attack Natural Order deck a few days ago. I think Show and Tell with Sneak Attack is like classic Legacy gameplay. If we're getting this on Arena alongside Sneak Attack, I'm pretty sure that'll be a deck. Gamble, pretty big deal for Historic Brawl. Could see some Timeless play in the Underworld Breach combo decks. In Breach, like, you tutor up your Breach, as long as you don't discard your Breach, you don't really care if you're discarding something because you're going to cast it from your graveyard anyway. Crashing Footfalls, currently one of the best things going in Modern. I don't know if we have the pieces to make it work on Arena, though. We're missing, like, the Shardless Agents, the Violent Outbursts, the 3-mana Cascade spells, but there might be a deck there with the Discover mechanic. Ghostly Prison, we'll see if it sees much constructed play, but definitely a good Historic Brawl card. Same for, like, Fabricate, tutoring up an Artifact, Victimize, pretty good reanimation in Historic Brawl. So not a ton of, like, super high-end stuff here, but some pretty exciting stuff thanks to the new art and new additions to Magic Arena. We also got all 4 of the Commander face cards from the set. So these cards, I'm not going to get into them. Tomer's going to cover them over on the MTG Goldfish Commander YouTube. So if you want to see a breakdown of these cards, make sure to head over there. We also got a sneak peek at Ravnica Clue Edition. And I gotta say, now that I've heard more about this set, this is the part of our return to Ravnica that I'm probably least excited about. So this is essentially a product where it's right now like $72. You would get 8 Jumpstart Lake booster packs. You get a foil Shockland for some reason, probably because they were afraid no one was going to buy this. So you spend $70, a foil Shockland, 8 Jumpstart boosters with a clue, like the game Clue theme. You see the cards like Mastermind Plum, Lavinia Foil to Conspiracy, locations and items from the game of Clue, like Library and Knife, and then you're supposed to, like, Jumpstart style, put them together and play a game, except the game you play, you also kind of make it like the game of Clue, so you can win by winning the game of Magic, or you can win by figuring out who done it. So if you attack and get in combat damage, apparently, you can, like, accuse someone, like Mastermind Plum in the library with a knife, and if you're right, then you just win the game on the spot. It is a very weird idea. They said during the stream that it's like the 75th anniversary of Clue, and Clue is also owned by Hasbro, so I'm starting to think that maybe this is one of those things that Hasbro's like, WotC, like, we really want you to make a Clue product, it's the 75th anniversary, so they made Magic Clue Jumpstart that's selling for $70 for a Shockland and a bunch of Jumpstart booster packs. So I'm curious what you think of this product. When I heard the full description, I was kind of like, oh, I wish this was like $30. If it was like $30 or something, or $40, and I was getting these Jumpstart packs and could play a unique game with it, you know, try it out, that'd be kind of cool. But $70 just seems so expensive for 8 Jumpstart packs, a Shockland, and some extras. Finally today, in the world of lower rarity cards, and I'm going to go over these super quick because this video is super long, but you should definitely go over and check them all out at mtgpreviews.com because there's actually some really solid commons and uncommons that we've seen from the set so far. But I want to mention a couple individually. No More Lies is literally an upgraded mana leak. Counter a spell unless its controller pays 3. If it was countered, it goes to exile instead of the graveyard. Only drawback is you do have to be an Azorius, but mana leaks a spell that we don't even have in Pioneer. That's how long it's been since WotC's reprinted Mana Leak, so seeing something this close to Mana Leak definitely noticeable. I imagine this is an auto-include in like Pioneer, in blue-white control, standard control style decks. Makes me thankful that we have Caverns of Souls, because this and Make Disappear, my goodness, would that be a lot of counter spells in a control deck in standard. Also, Long Goodbye is worth noting. 2 mana instant, destroy target creature planeswalker with mana value 3 or less, so that's literally the card Eliminate, but you get the upgrade of this spell can't be countered. So this is the way you can always get rid of like a Teferi Time Raveler, a Wrenn 6, ward creatures like in standard, like Graveyard Glutton, a Graveyard Trespasser. This is going to get rid of it in the can't be countered mode, so you don't need to worry about your opponent having a counter, paying the ward, anything like that. So I think this is definitely a card that will serve a purpose in Constructed as well. We also got Crime Novelist. So we've been talking about spoilers from Murders at Karlov Manor for like an hour now, and I'm pretty sure the most posted card of the day is this random uncommon. So 3 mana 1/3 Goblin Bard says whenever you sack an artifact, put a counter on it and you make a red mana. So I think this card is actually kind of ridiculous with treasures. So this is a card that if you have a treasure out, you sack it, you get the mana from the treasure and another mana from the Crime Novelist, and you grow the Crime Novelist. So now your treasures crack for 2 mana rather than 1 mana, but it does more than that as well. Like your blood tokens crack for free, right? You spend a mana to crack them, but you get back the mana and grow your Crime Novelist. Your clue tokens suddenly crack for 1 mana, or maybe you have another activated ability cost reduction out there, like some sort of training ground style effect. Then you're able to crack them for free and just draw through your deck. So I feel like Crime Novelist is just a card that's waiting to be comboed off with. I would not be at all surprised if this ended up being like the Pitiless Plunderer of the set, this uncommon that actually is just an absurd combo engine. Whether or not it makes it in Constructed, we'll have to wait and see. I think there's a chance. I think it's definitely possible this is good enough for Constructed. But worst case, I imagine we're going to see a lot of like, hey, my deck goes infinite with Crime Novelist decks in Commander, because it seems so easy to actually make this go off. Otherwise, as I said, there is a ton more lower rarity stuff, way more than we can actually get into individually, but you should check it all out over at mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers for today, and I want to know what you think. We got a pretty big look at this set today. A lot of mythics, a lot of rares, all the new mechanics. What's your hype level? What are you excited for? I gotta say, I really love the design of this set. So far, nothing outside of that random double your treasure mana goblin thing has really jumped out as like, oh my god, I think this is broken. But there's a lot of stuff that looks really powerful. It looks really fun to play with. The mechanics are all super unique and super fun. So I'm actually very hyped about how this set's gonna play in practice. But I want to know what you think. What are you most excited for? What are you down on? What are you up for? What's your hype level for the set? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, check out the video where we talked about this best spell from every year of Magic the Gathering. Or maybe the one where we taught Arena Zoomers the power of Necro.